In all the years before, we've of course been joined by a very special person, Professor Tan Sri Dr. Khoo Kim on Malaysia Day. Widely regarded as Malaysia's national historian, he often reminded us as to where we're coming from and how this great country was formed. Unfortunately, we lost him earlier this year. Let us now take a minute to pay tribute and remember Tan Sri Khoo Kim.
Kepercayaan pada Tuhan, kesetiaan kepada raja dan negara, keluhuran perlembagaan, kedaulatan undang-undang, kesopanan dan kesusilaan. Kepercayaan pada Tuhan, kesetiaan kepada raja.
Eddin, Khoo, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
The topic for tonight's discussion, an ideal Malaysia. Is it realistic or a utopian dream? Thank you for being with me. I eagerly look forward to getting all the various perspectives of my panelists here tonight with me. And with that, let me first introduce all of them. Indeed, I'm privileged to be joined by Eddin Khoo, writer and founder of PUSAKA, Farhan Iqbal, photographer as well as a social activist, senior lecturer of Gender Department, University of Malaya, Dr. Vilashini Somiah. Thank you for being here. TV anchor Nadiah, Latif, as well as leadership coach Faridah, Hameed. Welcome back. And of course, joining us for the first time, Fila Magnus, communications director of the International Youth Alliance for Family Planning. Welcome all, and happy Malaysia Day.
Happy Malaysia
Day. All right. So of course, it's going to be a truly interesting discussion here. I just want to open up with this quote from our Prime Minister Tun Mahathir at his National Day speech. And what he had to say was, quote unquote, "The goodwill, tolerance and readiness to give and share, which were the foundation of the country when it achieved independence 62 years ago, must be preserved as Malaysia moves forward." And within a blink of an eye, here we are. Another year has passed, and Malaysia, of course, is 1 year older. It's no doubt that, of course, during this period, there's that fire of patriotism that burns hotter in our hearts than any other time, any other period in the year. But the big question is Malaysia the Malaysia you and I have hoped for? Is it the Malaysia we've dreamed of, or we dream that it would be? So the big question is, an ideal Malaysia, real or utopia? I'd like to open up with that question first. Perhaps I can start with you, Eddin. What do you feel? Where are we right now, or is it a long journey still?
Thank you for the tribute to my father, which was extremely moving. Makes it difficult to talk now, but no, I think nations are not idealistic things, and we know the philosophical approach to a nation is that it's an imagined community, and that nations are always in the process. They never arrive.
So it's always a journey.
It's always a journey. And I've been grappling with this idea. We think often that nations build communities, when actually nations are founded on communities. And so I think for a country like Malaysia, for the entire region, Southeast Asian region, actually I think the very complex cultural interactions that have defined what made us a nation and what made us a region, I think our perspective needs to be constantly rooted in that. It's something my father emphasized all the time, and you know, it's the first Merdeka and Malaysia Day that he's not on TV, and I don't have something to quarrel with him about when he comes home. But I think that aspect, that we really need to be rooted in our sense of history, in our life as a community, and in our cultural understanding of each other.
Yeah. I'd just like to add to what Eddin has said. I think any nation, the idea of a nationhood is we are a social experiment. That's what any nation is. And like any social experiment, we have our flawed decisions that are made and the good decisions that are made. So I think the important thing that we need to think about is it's not about being an ideal nation, because that's a process, it's a journey, as Eddin rightly said. So in that experiment, where are we today in relation to the region in which we live and the world around us as well? Because unlike when we first got independence, today we are subject to a lot of external forces. A lot of things are happening over which we have very little control. So the identity of ourselves as a nation, where is our identity there? And I think that is the one that we have to think about, because what is that that forward vision that we have for our nation, and that has to take into account where we think we are today, and where is it we want to go. And that, to me, I think is where we are grappling with, because of all the issues that we are facing both internally, as well as grappling with the external forces that are influencing some of the decisions that we're having to make.
Where would be that ideal point of destination, Dr. Vila?
Okay, an ideal Malaysia would be one without any haze. But I think I echo the sentiments of both my colleagues here today. Particularly, I think one thing we constantly have to realize is that there's this point where you look at, how much progress has been made in the last 62 years, right? And then you look at your weakest links. Okay, where within the fringes do we still need to work on? And that in its own is, having that conversation, expanding that discourse, has a lot to do with the sort of maturity that the nation will eventually have to find themselves in. And so I think for where we're at 62, aren't we 62? Yeah, at 62. We've done really well. If you compare us with a lot of other nations in the region and other nations in Asia, we've done really well. We've recently had perhaps the most easiest change of government compared to a lot of other Asian countries. That's certainly something to be celebrated. We now have an ability to open discourse for a lot of other things. So for that reason, I think we've got there's a lot to celebrate. But at the same time, I think and sorry to sort of interrupt you, there are also fringe issues that we have to pay attention to. And if we can sort of make a comparison between the two, then at least we have a very idealistic view of where we're headed and where we should head.
Okay, I'll come back to what those fringe issues might be, but perhaps you could help us answer this. It's only been a year plus since we've gained, this breath of fresh air, so to say, Malaysia Baru. Has it been what Malaysians hope it would be? You go down to the ground a lot. Do you see that in the people's reflection towards how they feel about the country?
Well, of course, if you go back 1 year ago, once the elections has unfolded and whatnot, we were very optimistic with the changes that might come, or that would come with the new government and whatnot. So I can speak on behalf, I suppose, of my generation and the ones younger. We are, I suppose, idealistic generation, I guess. So we wish for a lot of things. We want a lot of things to be achieved. We want our future to be as utopian as possible. But over time, of course, on the ground sentiment sort of waded away from being very optimistic to slowly being a bit more cautious with certain things. Are we getting a repeat of the previous government? Are we getting a new government? Or are people just playing the ball game to transition into a better government or whatnot? But that optimism is still there. I think it's never really died off fully yet, maybe.
So we're still
very hopeful.
Dream to come through. What about both of you, Nadiah and Fila?
Yeah, I mean, Malaysia is at a very interesting point of time. As we've said, we're in a whole new year where things have just changed. And I think that we are hopeful that things are moving towards the betterment of the country, but at the same time, we are also, as Farhan has said, we've become more cautious. We're afraid of what the reality is going to show in the next few years. But I feel like people on the ground, or at least for myself, the only person I can speak for really, is the fact that we're going to get there. We're just not there yet. And how do we get there? That's something, I don't know. We'll see.
That's a big question. How do we get there, and rather also when we will get there?
Yeah. So the running theme that we had throughout the whole day of different interviews, from Zuna in the morning, and then Tan Sri Raymond and Ras and Prof. Rosita, again and again we hear the topic of maturity. We were talking about nationhood. If you don't know and you don't appreciate your history, how are you going to know where you're going to go?
Pretty much like what
and at the same time, I think Malaysia Baru is a little bit like an adolescent. It wants its rights, it wants its ability to speak up, but it's still grappling with issues of responsibility. I mean, it's great to want all these set of rights to say, this is the heart of the rakyat to want this and that, but we're still grappling with the fact that, okay, to do that, we need to be responsible for X, Y, Z. And we're like, I'm not sure if I want to go down that route, but I'd like to have the icing on my cupcake. So we're still grappling with certain issues, but like Zuna rightly pointed out, if you can address what these key issues are, you're going to have a pretty good nation moving on. Of course, based on maturity, based on compassion, mutual respect.
Absolutely. So I guess the question is to qualify what really defines an ideal country. What kind of qualities, what kind of infrastructure, policies will make a country ideal? Faridah?
Yeah, I grapple with the word ideal. For me, all I can talk about is what I'm grappling with at the moment, which is I am a very optimistic person by nature, right? So just like everybody else here, when we had the transition of the government, we were all like, whoa, we're going to see a lot of change and things are going to happen. And for a lot of us, I think we are sort of like now like, what? Like things aren't moving quite as fast as we wanted it to move. But having said that, I think coming from a more mature perspective, I think I'm one of the oldest on this panel, at the risk of admitting that. But I think when you look at it from a mature perspective, anything to do with change takes time. Even us, right? No matter how young or how old you are, how long does it take you to even change one habit or one mindset? So when you transfer that to the way a nation is, and you talk about the cabinet and trying to make everybody happy, and you've got all these constituents that you're trying to balance, I think that is a huge challenge. I think none of us here want to go into politics precisely because that's one of the huge things that we find troublesome. Right. So for me, if you're talking about what I would like to focus on, I think for me it is that idea of being called a Malaysian, because I'm sick and tired of having to write my race and my religion in a lot of these forms that we have out there. I think that's the one. If there was one wish I could have to bring us towards that unity, it would be if I could just call myself a Malaysian without having to identify my race or religion.
No forms and boxes to check.
But with the understanding that there would be some research and some population census that would require that for policy making. But otherwise, let's just do away.
Does everyone feel the same about
this? This is exactly what Ras Adiba mentioned in the afternoon, and she was saying, I am a product of a mixed marriage and my lineage has got basically all the different races. So do I take dan lain lagi? Where do I fit? And I think most of us are now a product of dan lain, right?
Yeah, I guess in due time as well there'll be more boxes. Yeah, because there'll be more variations as well.
I think I do believe that a little bit of turbulence actually is an indication of going down the right direction. Actually, you do need those sort of growing pains to come in, but not too much of it. Then it's just anarchy. That's just chaos, right? But for me, if we're headed towards a quote unquote ideal Malaysia, and also I problematize the word ideal. I think there's a problem with that term. Is that there's this huge conversation about equality, but I don't think it's that. I think it's actually equity. Right? You don't want the same thing for everybody, but you want enough for everybody so that they can achieve their own levels of success. And if as Malaysians we're able to go down that direction, and it takes everybody to be involved in that. Of course, the machinery the government possesses, and they're able to do that. They have the resources, but it requires really all hands on deck. And I think if we can sort of head towards a direction where you grow a language and a vocabulary of equity, then certainly that helps us with these building blocks.
I didn't really like to
that's a good point, because ideals, centuries ago, a man in prison wrote a book called Utopia. And if you read the book Utopia, it's a very, very boring place to live. You don't want to find yourself in that. Or I think nations really subsist on quarrel. We must be able to quarrel. And I always say, if we don't quarrel, the spin-off is that we fight. That's a very dangerous thing. But to constantly be engaged in a very positive and progressive quarrel is very important. I overheard a conversation the other day in the bookstore, and somebody was complaining about the present administration, really complaining. And his friend turned around to him and said, well, you voted for them. And the reply that came was very sharp and really encapsulated, I think, our predicament. The reply was, can you blame me? So many of the things that have arisen in our conversation, just our conversation here, is also a matter of language. You know? So equality, equity, race, religion. We have inherited a lot of the language.
Right.
I think it's about time now we grow up and really try and make sense of that language. That's a very important thing to do. That includes everything from media to analysis. I think our analysis has been, our political analysis is really quite still at a very amateur state. We need to be able to look at things a lot more comprehensively, be able to respond with far greater intellect into the very, very complex issues that we are about to confront.
All right, I want you all to hold on to your thoughts. We're going to take a quick commercial break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Screen once again, welcome back to my panelists. Thank you very much for being here in the studio with me. We also have a contest for those who've been watching throughout the 24-hour broadcast. So far, 17 hours clocked in. We have what we call the accumulated question or the accumulated quiz, as well as the creative slogan. So if you'd like to know more, please log on to Facebook. Like all our different Facebook pages, it's Bernama Radio, Bernama News Channel, as well as Bernama itself. Share this Facebook Live link, and of course, like the page. You'll get all the information you need for the running contest from there. So welcome back again. We took a quick commercial break. We had a quick sip of water as well in between that. Before the break, we did speak about some of the other issues. Of course, you had mentioned, Dr. Villa, about some fringe issues. I want to go back to that really. What are these fringe issues, if you could highlight perhaps 3 to start this conversation?
Well, I highlight one. It's Malaysia Day, or it was Malaysia Day 25 minutes ago. Malaysia Day is only celebrated because you have 3 equal partners who came to the table that agreed to form Malaysia. You've got the Peninsula, and you've got Sabah and Sarawak. And if anything, I think one of the more pressing fringe issues to really pay attention to is how do you give agency and how do you help empower or direct empowerment to many of those who are living in Sabah and Sarawak who don't see themselves as equal partners. I think the one thing that a lot of people cannot come to terms with is that Sabah and Sarawak are not states, they're equal partners, right? And I think changing that narrative, along with many other narratives, is going to be very difficult.
So how do we strive for better integration? Through what medium? Through what channels? Farhan?
Well, when it comes to rewriting narratives or introducing new narratives, I think the best way to do it is to start with the younger generation. So when it comes to the younger generation, you need to start educating them better on what Malaysia Day is all about, the spirit of Malaysia Day, the spirit of the union, especially with Sabah and Sarawak as equal partners rather than just states. So I suppose, like for me, I would rather be interested in reading up more on the narratives of Sabah and Sarawak rather than just the peninsula. So we've always had this, I suppose, we've been bombarded by stories about other states in the peninsula, but never about Sabah and Sarawak. We only hear about Sabah and Sarawak when it comes to Malaysia Day, when it comes to Hari Gawai, and also when it comes to, I suppose, elections. That's pretty much about it.
Absolutely. Do you feel the same way?
I'm going to have to be like the damper in this whole thing, but I cannot agree with you more. And I'll just add one more to that, the issue of Orang Asli in Malaysia, for example. Very often we're talking about Peninsular Malaysia, we're talking about all the different advancement that we've had, which is actually very Peninsular Malaysia centric. The narrative not only about stories and culture and heritage and history of both North Borneo, once upon a time, now Sabah and Sarawak, but also the people who were the original people of Malaysia, Orang Asli. I mean, we were just talking to Clive some weeks back, and he was talking about the fact that in schools, Orang Asli children don't even know their own history. It's wiped out because we're talking about everybody else.
Eddin, you seem like you want to say something.
You know what is very interesting is Malaysia has been able to get some of its best brains together and evolve a really distinctive constitution for a multicultural, multi-religious society. We then evolved the narrative to include the Malaysia Agreement. What we constantly seem to do, even the new economic policy is a very, very interesting blueprint. But the fact that we are cursed with identity politics means that we keep shooting ourselves in the kneecap with every great thing we have created. So what I think really needs to be done is to create an evolved narrative, you know, so that we have a real sense of what the evolution of the country and its communities has been. I'm also quite worried, for example, about the either-or. It should be Merdeka Day or Malaysia Day. It should be, you know, that's really an infantile way of grappling with these things. But if we are able to have an expansive enough imagination to include all these stories, and if you're talking about states, you know, the peninsula itself is hugely balkanized, okay, between the south and the west coast and the east coast. I do so much work in Kelantan, Terengganu. You know, people still, you go to Kelantan, what do you do there? It's crazy, you know. So we have not had an integrated imagination. And so we have not had an integrated narrative, and that's something we need to achieve. And we should also stop blaming the education system all the time for this.
It's going to come to that.
Education begins at home.
Yes.
I hope parents will start to take some responsibility about how they bring up their children, what kind of values and what kind of storyline they seek to bequeath their kids.
Fila, what do you feel about this?
I mean, I can't agree more with Eddin. Honestly, the reality today is the fact that we like to blame everybody else for the narrative that we have today. But the reality is this narratives have started at home for a lot of us. Why does a person believe a certain way? It's all just because of what they've grown up with. And so with that reality, with that understanding, we need to come back and just take a step back and realize that the parents is where it starts. The adults, we focus a lot on the youth today and how it starts with them and all of that stuff. But there's no development of the youth without actually changing mindsets of the adults that are teaching them. You know, because we are at a standpoint where everybody's like, oh my God, the young people are saying this, the young people are saying that. But who are teaching them? Who's raising these young people? And then until and unless we're able to change the mindsets of the adults, the parents, the teachers of today, changing tomorrow is a lot more difficult.
Right, a quick fun fact as well, your grandfather in fact was the person who designed the Bernama logo, the big B that you see. That was done by your granddad. So yeah, it's a full circle.
Full
that you're
circle
back
right
here
here, exactly.
That's right, representing,
that's right.
What's your thoughts, Faridah?
I have a slightly different view about the role of the education system from Eddin. I do agree, of course, that ultimately all education begins at home. But when I think about my schooling days and the history of the country, see, the problem I see now is Malaysia is very good at having slogans and talking about things, but the experience is missing. So when you talk about Merdeka Day, when you talk about Merdeka Day, people spew slogans and they talk about certain things. But how many young people today really understand, beyond the older generation, right? How many young people understand how this country was brought together, all the struggles that went, all the compromises that had to be made to make Malaysia in those days, right? So there is a role, I think, for the education system. There has to be a role, because that's how I learned about how this country was made. The problem is a lot of this has been erased from history books, right? So we have to then evaluate now what is going into those history books, because that is the narrative that is being put forward, which like, you know, we were talking about the Orang Asli and the Sabah Sarawak, but there's also all the other people who built this country.
No, I mean, I completely agree, because that sense of detachment also allows people to hijack certain narratives as well. This even creates more disruption, more, I suppose, people get more detached, more division. So it completely goes back to...
My concern here is that, just jumping off what was just said about education and history, is that knowledge is incredibly political here, right? It's politicized and it's political. And it becomes very, I mean, why are we constantly harping on the fact that we don't get enough information from our history books, school history books, right? You're talking about textbooks. Because the fact that if you wanted to put just a footnote about Hang Jebat or Hang Tuah, it becomes a huge conversation. It becomes a huge argument. It's a debate, and it can an emotional debate, a very difficult one. And so instead of going down that route where we say, okay, let's sort of fight this out, or let's argue this out, let's not put that in the books, because we're clearly not ready to have this conversation. And so we're not ready to have a conversation, or we're not ready to impart knowledge, historical knowledge into these books, simply because a group of people have now realized, or they've categorized a selection of knowledges to be incredibly politicized and political. So step number one is that you kind of have to put everything out there, and everybody just has to be bad cop, good cop at multiple times, and you just have to rip the band-aid off, because clearly the more you censor, the less people are going to know. It's not that children can't learn, it's not that the youth don't want to know, it's because you now have decided that certain information, certain knowledges are not worthy to be talked about because it's too sensitive.
So are we mature enough to agree to disagree?
You know why? You know why? So all of these things, as the good doctor says, have been knowledge is politicized, and then it is sublimated.
Yes.
Okay. And so much of how intensive our identity politics has become is the fact that victimology, a culture of victimology, then gets exacerbated.
Right.
So that, for example, today we can't learn about the emergency. There was a big hoo-ha about whether the emergency can be taught in history books. I learned it in school
So did I.
in the 1980s.
I didn't.
I didn't.
I didn't.
In Field textbook, it was there, written, in
We had
an
the abridged
entire
version.
chapter.
Oh, mine was
but-
shorter than the abridged version.
So there are many things that we actually did learn at one time, had no problems learning, that today are no-go areas. This is extremely dangerous for me. And remember, it is the system that perpetuates this. It is the modern system, the contemporary system that perpetuates this. And how do we get away from addressing it? We deflect. We're constantly deflecting, looking at Japan.
Or make it into a big issue.
Yeah, or looking at
Just
Finland
censor.
and creating all
So
those.
we're never really addressing the elephant or elephants in the room. At what point can do you think we might be mature enough to have these conversations out in the open? Because up till now, there hasn't been
We are
anything.
mature enough.
Absolutely. I think we are mature. I don't think we should be told we are not mature. And I think this younger generation, the Gen Z or millennials and all that, I don't like to label, I'm sorry, I don't like to label, but for the cause of the discussion, I think, why are we being told we are not mature enough when in my generation we were mature enough to...
No, the great irony too is that those conversations are being had, they're being had in a very mature way. The most immature people are sitting in parliament. Making laws.
The immaturity is in the decision.
Okay, so then the question is, what role, besides what is already being done, can the government do to perpetuate unity or discussions, open discussions?
Don't
and
infantilize don't infantilize them, because I think that's it. It's always thinking for a community or an entire section of society that something is not, you either get confused, you're not ready for it. These are very dangerous narratives, as Eddin has put out. They're very dangerous, because then if you're not going to allow me to have this open discourse, I'm going to make up my own stuff somewhere else, and I'm going to bring it bring it to the public.
And I think as rakyat, we need to hold our government accountable in the sense that whenever they hijack a narrative or hijack a discourse, a proper discourse being held by the rakyat, penalize them, hold them responsible. I think there are a lot of people who are trying to have a proper discussion on certain things of our historical past. So why are they telling them, no, don't have this, if you do this, you're a traitor, you're this, you're that? You're not supposed to do that. You're not the babysitter. The rakyat is supposed to have their own discourse.
I'll add one more thing to that actually. I think while we hold the government accountable, I still feel that we should be holding ourselves accountable too, because very often it's easier to criticize than to do. I mean, I've had multiple engagements with the government, and what we've usually seen is, yes, they try and get all the different stakeholders to talk about the issues, and then after that it'll go back to like, oh, this is going to take time to do, so we're just going to look at the low-hanging fruits, and then from 10 different issues, it gets shrunk into one that you work on. But there are 9 other issues that you've swept under the carpet that really needs addressing. And I've also come to realize that we keep going back to the fact that the government doesn't have money. I'm sorry if I'm saying this when I shouldn't. But there are a lot of different things that we can fix in Malaysia that does not need money, that does not need millions and billions of ringgit, and it starts from all of us. At least that's what I think.
And I think that as a developing nation, the more important ones are the immaterial values. These are the ones that really are required to develop the nation. It's not our MRT projects, it's not our public infrastructure. We don't really care about that unless we really work on the core values of the nation. We won't develop.
All right. So basically, based on that, what specific programs do you think can be carried out, can be rolled out, or would you suggest they can be done immediately? As a suggestion to the government.
Yeah, mine's not immediate. Okay. Well, it's sort of immediate. I'll go back to education. I think if you're talking about unity and integration, you have to start with the schools, right? So there has to be some effort to make them experience what it's like. We cannot have all these schools that are, sekolah kebangsaan, that have been hijacked for certain reasons. We have to have this multiracial sekolah kebangsaan. I grew up at a time when all these sekolah kebangsaan were multiracial. We didn't even think about you are Chinese, I'm Indian, you're Malay, whatever. We didn't have those conversations. And it's so sad to see that now all our schools are places of divisiveness rather than of unity. That's where we have to start, because then you don't even have to have. Today I was reading in the paper, somebody was saying, I think it was saying, oh, we have to have a charter for unity and all that. That is all. It's all superficial stuff. You want to get to the core, you have to create an environment where people experience what it's like on a day-to-day basis, to have a diversity of ideas, to have a diversity of experiences, to look at somebody else in the eye and not judge them completely by their race or religion. That you can just talk about things, because that's how I became this person that I was, that I had friends from all different races and religions.
Right, you say that there are 3 phrases that need to be said or needs to be part of the vocabulary
of leaders,
of politicians or leaders. What are those?
I think we live in a society now that politicians or leaders are so scared to say that I'm wrong or I don't know. And I think that's something they just have to start owning. Because the problem with not saying that I don't know or I may be wrong is that then you perpetuate this idea that Big Brother knows all. And then you're going to go down a path where you think you know all. The other thing I will say is that we need to have this diversity of opinions, like what Eddin was saying early on. I think if we don't quarrel, then we have conflict. So we need to bring people into the room that we do not agree with, because we do need to hear their point of view. Of course, you don't want the extreme left wing or the right wing, but there are reasonable people who I think want the Malaysia that we're all talking about. And my final point, right, is that when we're making policy, we have to bring people into the room who live that every day. So I'll go back to the education example, right? We need to bring parents and children who are learning, whether in colleges, universities, or even secondary schools, they have to be part of the conversation about what's working and what's not working. Because this whole idea of politicians alone making those policies, it doesn't work anymore. We have to have the conversation where people who are impacted by whatever is going on, whether it's domestic violence or whether it's child marriage or whatever that may be, those people must be part of the conversation.
But do you feel that those conversations are happening anyway on social media?
Yeah, but social media is a whole different ballgame.
Social media is rubbish. I've emphasized this time and again in media organizations like this. When this issue of social media is brought up, and always social media says this, social media says this. Social media is a landscape for lunacy. Okay, and finally, really mad people have their channel to express their views and their opinions. I don't understand why the national media takes these people seriously. And these are not conversations we're supposed to be having on social media. You can't have it anyway. You just observe somebody starts an interesting conversation and serious conversation on Facebook, and all of a sudden it gets into mudslanging and the worst kind of language done by educated people. So I'm very, 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 very circumspect about this whole education business, right?
But on the other hand, perhaps it's a reflection of how the people feel, the sentiments of the people, their opinions, their experiences.
Sorry, I need to finish this.
Sure.
Governments should not interfere. Governments should leave people alone. The point of a government is to facilitate. And by facilitating, it becomes consultative. Now, that's what I think a lot of people voted for. I think in the last election, a lot of people voted for something called collective dignity. Okay, I think the nation was just so undermined. So government now should really play that role, to be consultative, to bring people with a great deal of expertise, specialization sometimes, and to really work from the beginning into setting all these things together, building all these things together again and implementing them properly.
Can I add something to what Eddin has just said about social media? Very, very quickly. I have zero social media presence because I chose not to have it because I suck at it. But more importantly is, I think to sort of expand on that is, I'm concerned about 2 things if we do take consideration from voices from the social media. Number 1, the echo chamber. Everybody who is like themselves and like-minded only stick to themselves and share their opinions. There is an echo. There are multiple echo chambers in Malaysian social media. Number 2, cyber troopers. And I'll just leave you with that.
Okay, we'll come back with that. We'll take a quick commercial break now. We'll be right back after these messages. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. We're talking about an ideal Malaysia rail or a utopian dream. Of course, I've got my panel here as well. Just before the break, we left off with cyber troopers. Are we falling prey to cyber troopers? And I want to open that question to everyone. Of course, Eddin, you say that it's landscape for lunacy. And there you have yourself, Dr. Villa, who you have absolutely no social media engagement.
I'm very proud to be completely social media clean, okay? Except for YouTube. But going back to my point, again, echo chambers, and number two, cyber troopers. I'm not saying that cyber troopers impact that much, but it certainly sort of, you know, it adds to the landscape of lunacy. I think it really does, because it's too fantastic. You know, copyright that, Eddin. I think that there's something to consider when you've got these voices coming from paid voices. You know, they're funded to a certain degree. They're coming from very different political stances, and they're adding to that. And you have to be really cautious about the kind of narratives that are weaved online, because again, you know, basically you can say anything you want. They can be as baseless as they want to be, or they can come from lived experience, and this is the problem, because you cannot tell.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is perhaps not a real reflection of the general dissatisfaction, perhaps just a case of few bad apples.
Can I share something? I'll quickly share. Okay, so on Twitter, I'm sorry, I'm an avid user of social media. On Twitter, I always had this disagreement with a specific individual, and I know he's not a cyber trooper, I know he's not a bot, so from time to time I always see him in mentions, we go back and forth with arguments and whatnot. So I was very intrigued to his stance. And one day I just decided, you know what, let's grab a coffee, let's sit down and have a chat.
Right.
And one thing that really struck me was the person who he is in person is way different
totally
than
different.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to that adding the atmosphere of lunacy in social media.
I think something happens to your brain.
Yeah, it switches off.
It's people get
I've
on
been
social
guilty of
media,
that as well.
like my granduncles. I mean, the garbage that they spread around. You know, and it's and when you call them on it, they know it's rubbish, but they can't seem to resist it. So I wonder if something physiological actually happens when you're behind this.
For me,
this kind of
Twitter is the place I go to talk to myself publicly. So
That's a good way to say it.
Right, okay.
So that might be one of it.
Okay, what do you all feel about patriotism? Nadiah, perhaps I could start with you.
Oh, okay. Well, for one thing, I think we are already in a state where we've come a long way. There's still a lot more to be done. I think patriotism, especially for the youngs, we work a lot with children, is a very nebulous concept. It's a concept that's hard to grapple with, especially when they did not live the stories that we're talking about today. Tunku is just, you know, a name in a book. Some of them don't even know that Tun Mahathir is Prime Minister round 2. So a lot of these concepts, while we're talking about it, and we're talking about the importance of bringing back that sense of history, that sense of loyalty, I worry whether or not we're in a bubble, because we're in a generation that is actually going off, and the next generation that's coming in, the tweeters, the people who, you know, a child has just killed herself because she was depressed, like, you know, or we've got haze and it's terrible, like. So this whole concept of patriotism, I think we haven't fully figured out how this is going to be, especially for the youth. We feel it, but are they going to be feeling it?
I think the problem is now there was a fight.
Yes.
Now there's no longer a fight
Correct.
to fight. So what is our fight now? So
Yes.
what?
To get more likes.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
where does the
literally,
patriotism
you
stand
know?
from there? So
Tula?
I mean, you're exactly right. I feel like as a youth, as a young person today, I don't know why I'm proud to be Malaysian anymore. And it's so difficult when you have the cyber troopers, you have social media not helping when...
Do it make you feel bad when you say that you don't feel patriotic?
It makes me feel bad, because I should love my country, and I should want to...
Ashamed.
Bad, ashamed, all these words also very true. Like, I feel like I shouldn't be feeling this way about the country that I was born in, the country that I will definitely die in. But at the same time, you can't blame me. You can't blame a young person, because what we're seeing, what we're looking at, policies that are not equal, policies that still push for one above the other. Things like this is something that I struggle with a lot, coming from the majority race. Oftentimes, I'm not okay with the narratives that are being spewed around by either sides. And social media does not help, because it provides a perspective of people just going and saying what they feel and what they think, again, with baseless things, really. So patriotism, at the end of the day, what is it when you're not in a fight? You don't have the struggle. You're not going through what everybody else had went through in the beginning. Where do we go from here? What do we do? How do we bring that love for Malaysia back when we can't love each other as much as we should?
I think for me, what I've noticed amongst my friends and as well for myself, we, instead of having one big uniting fight, we have our own personal fights.
Yes.
Right.
So, like for me, I try to help as much as I can with the poor, or someone tries to help as much as they can with, I suppose, victims of abuse and whatnot. So, is that I suppose patriotism stems from that fight of trying to help
has to be a struggle,
different,
right?
a different.
I want to say something. For me, it's two very simple things. Patriotism to me is like when I'm coming back from a foreign country and they say welcome back to Malaysia, and that feeling of pride that I have. Very simply, I always feel so proud when I'm back in the country, because it's often when you leave the country and you see how things are there, then you appreciate when you come back that with all our warts, all our problems, all our fights, this is still a really good place to live. The second thing for me, when I talk about patriotism, for me is very simple. When I want for someone else what I have, and particularly those who are marginalized. Because for me, how can you talk about a developing country or a developed country when that feeling of that there's somebody else who needs a hand up, and that person, for whatever reason, is not getting it. So I want for that person all the opportunities that I also have had. So for me, that is what I think about.
The fight for them.
I'd like to say something a little bit controversial. I'm a little bit concerned that, patriotism has to be performed. And I think these are two different things. There's lived patriotism, which isn't really, it's kind of like charity is another category. Do you perform it or do you live it, right? And I think patriotism comes back to the same thing. I'm concerned that when we say how patriotic are you, is that we have to perform it, because it really isn't about. That's artificial. That's staged, right? If you really want to know the level of patriotism that people have, it's a question that you don't ask. It's not having to put everything on, on the media to say that you've helped somebody of a different race and, ticking certain boxes. Because I think this is the problem. If you really want patriotism to exist in everybody's heart, you have to stop asking people to perform it.
Eddin?
Well, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. Which is what Dr. Johnson said. But I think there's one aspect that is really not being addressed here. I think our society is still highly colonized. We're colonized in the head. And a society, we are not as a society allowing ourselves to be all that we can be. We live in a completely cosmopolitan society that still worships the English language. I hear people who go to school from Standard 1 to Form 5, and they spend 2 years away and come back and they don't speak Malay, and that's absolutely disgraceful. When we should all actually be at least trilingual, and we are not giving ourselves. We don't travel the country. I mean, policies, I agree totally with I speak a lot to my students who feel very alienated because they're constantly told to be patriotic. They need to perform it. They are not told anything about their country. They are not allowed to go and seek it, because their parents are so protective these days. So on all levels, the experience of what the country actually can be and should be is not fully explored. You need to clock in your miles. You need to travel. You need to go out and you meet the country in its people. Something I've done for 30 years. Every single village in this country, looking for culture, looking for Mak-Yong, looking for Wayang Kulit. That's how it's done. And we have one of the most beautiful national anthems in the world. It's beautiful because it was first a keroncong song, right? And made into a... But that line, Tanah Tumpahnya Darahku, my blood upon the country, is really what our patriotism should be encapsulated in. It's a lyrical line, and this country essentially is very lyrical and poetic. And that's the kind of patriotism I think we need to imbibe and discover.
I actually think if the politicians get out of the way,
Absolutely.
a lot of these problems will be solved. Yeah, because they are hijacking the narrative in many ways.
Do you see a new wave of perhaps them who are in power, leaders, who will have a new mindset with Malaysia Baru, and after conversations like this, as you say, we are mature enough. Do you see a new wave of leadership coming through?
It's very difficult to say because even the simplest of things will be talked about, like a Malay issue or a Chinese issue or an Indian issue.
I guess then that brings to the question, unity in diversity. Is that just a catchphrase we love using? Harmony,
behind us right now is unity ribbon.
But we all are wearing the unity ribbon. Of course, that represents, I guess the dream as well. So how do we address this? I mean, what are pillars of unity at the end of the day for Malaysians?
Respect and understanding. So you respect the differences that we have, other races, other cultures, other religions, and I suppose respecting is just not enough. You have to take the additional step to understand these differences. Because if you hate something you don't know, you're just a bigot. So you can't hate something that you really understand. So I think that's one of the key factors of unity in diversity.
Right. I think under that umbrella, it's to afford people the recognition that they deserve. Malaysians live many different beautiful lives all over the country, and very very varied at the same time, and that sort of recognition needs to be given. Somebody who's living in Perlis lives a completely different life than somebody all the way in Cebu in Sarawak, right? And the fact that if the conversation is always about but what do we have in common, then we're missing the point, because the fact of the matter is you have to know what we don't have in common. And when you can get there and appreciate the sort of differences at play, then we're headed down the right road.
We talked about our strength being the fact that we are different, but we're all under one roof and we come together. But as we discussed, we see more and more there is that divide, there are that differences. And so, what would be, in your opinion, perhaps the end goal or the end game in terms of getting everybody together?
We were having this discussion in a meeting earlier, right, Jesse, you and I, and we were asking, is there such a thing as an end game? We're talking about, we've got issues with the word ideal and zero. It's a continuously evolving process. By the time we get to the end game, we want something else. But I think if we continue down that path of wanting people to be treated the same way we would want to be treated, like you rightly pointed out, that respect, that understanding, that empathy, then that these are the core facets that no matter how many times we change as a government, really, in my mind, people have been autopiloting, regardless of who's in position of power. I think by and large, people know how to behave with each other, yes, with the exception of a few, but it's back to that, treating other people the same way we want to be treated.
Where do you see Malaysia in the next 10 years, Eddin, from where we are today?
Is this the last word?
Yeah, we still got some time.
Oh, okay. In 10 years, I hope that we'll be completely overhauled. We need a serious look back.
And in just one quick moment, we've just got a word that Mr. Sambadan is watching us, and he's actually tearing up with our conversation. So he is, perhaps agreeing with a lot of the sentiments and a lot of opinions that are happening here. And again, a big shout out to all Malaysians, watching nationwide. If we come together, we stick together, we really can progress to the Malaysia that we dream of. That utopia can become a reality. I think back to you.
When people ushered in Malaysia Baru, it was very important to remind them that so much of Malaysia Baru was all about Malaysia Lama. So what we need is a great deal of retrospective introspection. As I said, we have been one of the most creative countries in terms of creating all the necessary policies, blueprints to manage what is a very, very difficult society. Yet we've constantly shot ourselves in the foot as a result of identity politics and increasing identity politics. So I think what we need is a serious rethink. And you cannot move forward if you have no sense of the past. So I think we should be spending at least this first period of this new administration doing exactly that.
The other big topic is, of course, there's concern of a global recession that's perhaps looming upon us as well. How do you think unity will help to confront this, Faridah?
I don't want to answer that question.
Okay.
Actually, I want to.
Okay.
I want to just take off
Okay,
from,
take from there,
the
babe.
earlier question. I was just thinking that we need thinking about where Malaysia needs to be 10 years from now. And this is, I'm going to be a bit controversial. I'm going to say that to me the future is about not having politicians as it's not going to be a career path.
Yeah.
And I think that's the stumbling block we're having, because I feel like as more technology and artificial intelligence comes into play, I'm hoping that we are going to have a select group of maybe elders or leaders who are appointed or elected by the electorate, and then we have all the data that will tell us where the money needs to go, who needs to be helped, what policies need to be done. So to me, that is what I would like to see 10 years
As we
from
sum
now.
up our discussion today, thank you very much for being here and sharing your thoughts. Very quickly, how would you sum up a Malaysia Day, of course, with all the salient points that we've highlighted as well? Very quickly, Dr. Vila.
Think of the people who are in the fringes. You are only as strong as your weakest link.
Okay.
And if you want the best for the country, you will do the best for them.
Farhan, very quickly.
I concur with her. Step outside your bubble, understand the rest of the Malaysians as well.
All right, Fila.
There's more than just you out there.
Yes.
Get out there and go see and venture out and see what's available for you to learn from.
Fantastic. Nadiah?
I think only when we are able to step forward and do something more and give something to someone that we would need ourselves through kindness, then we would probably be able to grow better as a
Eddin,
nation.
the last word.
Yeah, we get rid of these community boxes and understand that we were a community hundreds of years before we were a nation. I think that's what made my father a national historian. He started to look at the interactions between all of the communities rather than study them in isolated ways. And once we get there, then we've really got the foundations of what makes a really thriving nation.
All right, fantastic. I guess as we wrap up, I guess the summary and the conclusion, if nothing else, is Malaysia is nothing without its people. It's you and I, all the different layers, like a kueh lapis with the different flavors and the different colors and the different shapes. That's what we are. And if we, of course, once again, stay united and move forward together with one vision, we will eventually get there, the dream that is Malaysia for all of us. That rounds up the time. Thank you once again, panelists. It's way past midnight. I'm sure you're all very tired as well. Here's wishing once again to all Malaysians very happy Malaysia Day. Let's all wave a nice and hearty goodbye to our viewers. Thank you very much for tuning in. Keep it locked on right here for more coming your way. See you. Bye.
Bye, Mom.